Hello, everyone. Before we begin, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're from and when you watched it. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. It's commonly accepted that, following Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Second World War commenced on September 1st of 1939. However, there are some who argue the war truly started 8 years earlier, during September of 1931, with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Back in the mid-19th century, Japan remained in the iron grip of the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogunate established a kind of medieval feudalism known as Shi no Kosho, with samurai warriors occupying the highest social strata, and in its closed country policy of Sakoku, aiming to limit trade, foreign influence, and the spread of Christianity. The policy led to a flourish of artistic and cultural advances. Yet, as you can imagine, prohibition of free trade led to significant economic downturns. By the mid-19th century, the food shortages caused by financial stagnation led to violent demonstrations among the Japanese peasantry, exposing the shogunate's weaknesses and hastening its inevitable downfall. Then finally, in 1868, Emperor Meiji was reinstated as the nation's divine leader, marking the beginning of an era known as the Restoration. The Meiji Restoration marked a pivotal moment in Japanese history for a number of different reasons. Firstly, the nation began industrializing like never before. Thanks to the introduction of steam-powered machinery, the Japanese silk industry experienced an unprecedented boom, while the introduction of the country's first railroad system saw productivity skyrocket. The Japanese established a telegraph system in their first national bank, along with their first power plants and large-scale factories. They wished to emulate the success of Britain and the United States and work closely with their new Western allies to drag Japan into the 20th century. The effort was a resounding success, and by the early 1900s, Japan had transformed itself from an insular island nation into a major regional power. Perhaps the best illustration of Japanese advancement is the result of the Russo-Japanese War. For hundreds of years, control of the Korean peninsula had been one of the Japanese military's supreme goals. But Imperial Russia, with its considerably larger army and navy, believed they could simply sweep the Japanese out of the way in their claim to both Korea and northern China. The Japanese attempted to peacefully negotiate, but the Russians seemed happy to let war decide the outcome. Yet this proved a grave error of judgment on their part. On February 9th of 1904, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet, which was based near the now Chinese city of Dalian. It proved a devastating blow and was followed by Japanese victories at Lushunku and Mukden. The Russian Baltic Fleet sailed over 20,000 miles to support their beleaguered ground troops, and in May of 1905, they destroyed the combined Japanese fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. But it was too late. The Japanese had made significant inroads into China's Manchuria province. But it wasn't merely their victories which forced the Russians to sue for peace. In just over 19 months of fighting, the Russians had incurred around 160,000 casualties. The Japanese, on the other hand, had suffered almost 500,000. But unlike the Russians, whose will to fight was beginning to waver, the morale of Japanese soldiers remained extremely high, thanks to their unshakable belief in both country and cause. A peace treaty was signed in the September of 1905, with Japan being granted huge swaths of Manchuria. With the process mediated by the US and UK, the Japanese came to view Britain and America as potential allies. So much so that at the outbreak of the First World War, Japan actually sided with the United Kingdom and began attacking German colonies in China and the Pacific. After a month-long siege, the Japanese flushed German soldiers from the Chinese city of Qingdao in November of 1914. They also wrestled the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands from the hands of the Hun, and provided invaluable support to Australian Navy in its hunt for the German warship, the SMS Emden. The Japanese proved to be an incredibly effective ally, and naturally, they were incredibly proud of their contributions to the war effort. But when peace finally came in November of 1918, the Japanese felt their efforts went unrewarded. Believing they'd be allowed to keep the territory they'd fought and died for, the Japanese were stunned when the Western powers ordered them to cede control of certain Pacific islands. They were also dismayed to discover that huge tariffs would be placed on their goods during peacetime, as a wave of so-called protectionist trade policies swept the globe. As a result, Japan's silk and agricultural industries began to suffer. But then in 1923, Japan was hit by the most devastating natural disaster in its recorded history, the Great Kanto earthquake. The earthquake is believed to have been the worst in Japanese history, and the extent of the destruction was nothing short of horrific. More than half of Tokyo was either leveled by the quake itself or engulfed in the flames that followed, while the port city of Yokohama was virtually obliterated, with more than 90% of its structures lying in rubble. The cities of Kawasaki and Yokosuka both received extensive fire damage, while numerous smaller towns and villages across Kanagawa, Saitama, and Ibaraki prefectures received extensive damage. In just 4 minutes and 48 seconds, hundreds of years of hard work and progress had been utterly laid to waste. Central Japan lay in ruins, and it was here that the seeds of militarism were first sown, in the fertile soil of national humiliation and economic instability. Without stable peacetime industry to devote themselves, the Japanese population turned to its generals for purpose and direction. The days of making war against the Russians and the Germans had been glorious, filled with pride and productivity, and as the factory doors closed, the ranks of the Imperial Army swelled dramatically. Japan's generals promised to guide its citizenry in the same way they guided their soldiers, to victory at any cost. They preached the doctrine of Kokutai, which demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and the state, and revived the ancient samurai ethos of Bushido, where ultimate honor lies in glorious self-sacrifice. Glorification of Japan's military victories crept into the nation's schools, where students were instilled with martial values, taught that the Japanese were a divine people, and told the country was destined for expansion. Any public figure or politician who suggested otherwise was targeted for assassination by either violent militants or members of the Japanese military. By 1931, and despite their reverence of the divine Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese military was firmly in control of the state apparatus, and for many years prior, they'd been preparing for war. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when, and every soldier in the Imperial Army knew all they had to do was wait. At least until one soldier, stationed on the Japanese-owned section of the South Manchuria Railway, grew tired of waiting and decided to hatch a plan. One evening in September of 1931, Colonel Seishiro Itagaki was musing over the Japanese concept of Gekokujo. Gekokujo is a Japanese word which describes when someone in a lower position of power overthrows someone in a higher position using either military or political might. And in the opinion of Colonel Itagaki, Manchuria presented the perfect opportunity for Gekokujo. The local Chinese garrison at Shenyang seemed poorly trained and poorly motivated. While Itagaki's troops were well-disciplined, well-equipped, and positively itching for a fight, he knew that, given the opportunity, he and his soldiers would inflict a crushing defeat on the numerically superior Chinese. So in order to get that opportunity, he decided to manufacture consent. On the night of September 18th of 1931, Colonel Itagaki ordered one of his soldiers to place explosives near the train tracks. When those explosives detonated, Itagaki told his superiors they were being shelled by Chinese artillery and begged for the opportunity to subdue the local Chinese garrison. He was granted permission, and the next morning, two Japanese artillery batteries opened fire on the local Chinese garrison. The ensuing infantry assault was so swift and ferocious that a Japanese force of just 500 defeated more than 7,000 Chinese soldiers. The war in the Pacific had begun, and when the Japanese prime minister tried to stop it, he too was assassinated in cold blood. China had been embroiled in civil conflict since the 20s, and although Japan had invaded territory that is now part of the People's Republic, the Chinese and Japanese governments were not officially at war yet. That all changed in July of 1937, when following a skirmish with Chinese forces, the Japanese officially declared war and began the full-scale invasion of the Chinese Republic. By August, the Japanese had captured Shanghai, but not without strong resistance and heavy casualties. And seeing as the Japanese were vastly outnumbered and far from home, General Iwane Matsui realized a single fatal strike was necessary to collapse the Chinese government and end the war. And so he volunteered to lead his army in a march on what was then China's capital city, Nanking. Chinese General Tang Shengji announced he and his garrison of 81,000 soldiers would defend Nanking to the death. But government officials, recognizing that the defenders were made up of untrained conscripts and wounded veterans, evacuated the city less than a week before the arrival of Japanese troops. But it wasn't merely their rapid advance which scared the Chinese so terribly. It was what the Japanese did along the way that struck terror into their hearts. Historian Peter Harmson asserts that the 170-mile strip of land between Shanghai and Nanking was transformed into a nightmarish zone of death and destruction, with Japanese fighter pilots later confessing to firing on Chinese farmers with their machine guns and 20-millimeter cannons for, and I quote, fun. Columns of marching Japanese soldiers also subjected civilians to extreme violence and cruelty, such as in one instance, where the occupants of a village named Nankian-tu were locked in their homes by Japanese soldiers under the pretense of imposing a curfew. The soldiers then set fire to the buildings, leaving nothing but ash and embers where the village and its people used to be. When a mother and child returned to find their village in flames, Japanese soldiers threw the woman's 2-year-old into the fire, stabbed her with bayonets, then tossed her bleeding body into a nearby creek. In another incident, a pregnant Chinese woman was beaten and violated so brutally that she lost the ability to walk. Japanese soldiers then cut open the belly of the pregnant woman, gouged out the fetus, then rounded up the remaining villagers and bayoneted them to death. A soldier of the Japanese 13th Division, Kurosu Tadanobu, wrote the following account of his unit's activities. We'd take all the men behind the houses and kill them with bayonets and knives. Then we'd lock up the women and children in a single house and violate them at night. Then before we left the next morning, we'd kill all the women and children, and to top it off, we'd set fire to the houses, so that even if anyone came back, they wouldn't have a place to live. Another account, attributed to a now anonymous Japanese journalist, attempted to explain the speed of the Japanese advance. The reason that the 10th Army is advancing to Nanking quite rapidly, he said, is due to the tacit consent among the officers and men that they could loot and violate women as much as they wish. Rather than face the horrors of the invading Japanese army, many Chinese civilians chose oblivion, with First Lieutenant Nishizawa Benkichi bearing witness to an incident in which 2 young Chinese ladies chose to drown rather than face capture. Perhaps one of the most infamous atrocities committed on the road to Nanking involved 2 Japanese officers engaging in a little friendly competition, and that competition involved a race to be the first man to behead 100 Chinese prisoners. Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Nodoshin rushed to behead every Chinese captive they could find with their razor-sharp Shin Gunto sabers. The competition was widely reported on in the Tokyo newspaper Nichi Nichi Shimbun, as well as the English-language publication, the Japan Advertiser, with both papers publishing regular updates. For one edition, Nichi Nichi Shimbun's front-page headline read, "Incredible record in contest to cut down 100 people. Mukai 106/Noda 105. Both second lieutenants go to extra innings." Lieutenants Mukai and Noda had such a close tally that it was declared impossible to determine who'd been the first to reach 100. Yet instead of calling it a draw, the two officers decided to continue their murderous contest until a clear winner could be decided. In the year 2000, revisionist scholars from Japan and the US argued that the contest had been an elaborate hoax with the purpose of fostering what they called national fighting spirit. The claim led to a 2005 lawsuit filed by the families of Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, by which they attempted to clear the names of their war criminal forefathers. Yet the suit was promptly dismissed by a Toiko district judge, who stated that the lieutenants admitted the fact that they raced to kill 100 people and have done so on multiple occasions. On December 8th of 1937, with the Japanese army just 15 miles away from Nanking city walls, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka arrived at the front. He was met by two lieutenant generals, who proudly informed him that the Japanese had almost completely surrounded the 300,000 Chinese troops in the vicinity of Nanking, and that preliminary negotiations suggested that the Chinese were ready to surrender. However, instead of issuing orders to accept surrendering soldiers as prisoners of war, Prince Asaka signed a now infamous order instructing his officers to kill all captives. It's also important to remember that the Japanese considered all Chinese men to be combatants, regardless of age or infirmity, meaning that, for all intent and purpose, Prince Asaka had given the order to slaughter almost every single person in the city of Nanking. On December 9th, and despite a valiant effort on the part of its Chinese defenders, the Imperial Japanese Army finally reached Nanking's city walls. Then, following an intense 4-day battle, a combination of fatigue and a complete breakdown in command and control led to the collapse of the Chinese resistance. General Tang Shengshi gave the order to retreat, and while many of his soldiers were able to reach safety, the order had failed to reach the ears of the so-called Chinese Supervisory Unit, who'd been issued strict instructions to execute any and all deserters. To their horror, many Chinese soldiers discovered that not only were they being hunted by the Japanese, but their own countrymen were scouring the now shell-scarred cityscape, gunning them down at random. On December 13th, when it became clear that Chinese resistance had been sufficiently worn down, the Japanese army units advanced toward Nanking's city gates, then smashed their way inside. That same afternoon, two small Japanese Navy fleets arrived on both sides of the Yangtze River, cutting off the escape of anyone hoping to take to its waters. At first, the advancing Japanese soldiers were met with an eerie quiet, but upon advancing deeper into the city, they began encountering pockets of terrified Chinese army holdouts. Having heard the rumors that the Japanese were slaughtering them, many fought to the bitter end rather than face capture. Yet after the Japanese began broadcasting messages to the besieged Chinese, promising them mercy if they laid down their arms, tens of thousands surrendered themselves. However, the Japanese didn't just detain uniformed Chinese soldiers as prisoners, and as previously stated, considered almost all adult males to be enemy combatants. In one incident, around 20,000 Chinese prisoners were led to a so-called detention facility near the village of Mufashan on the banks of the Yangtze River. Each had been told that their surrender meant they would be spared and were led to a large barbed wire cordon surrounded by Japanese machine guns. They were told the machine guns were for security purposes, forming the ultimate line of defense in the event of a riot among the prisoners. It was a lie. At dawn the next morning, as tens of thousands of Chinese prisoners woke up and began to rise to their feet, the Japanese opened fire with their heavy machine guns. Swathes of Chinese prisoners were scythed down like wheat, and in the panic, they rushed the barbed wire cordon. Scores were shot and killed as they attempted to climb over the razor-sharp wire, forming human bridges for other prisoners to scramble over. Soldiers from the Yamada detachment were forced to fire on fleeing prisoners in order to prevent their escape. A storm of lead carving flesh from bone. When it was over, Japanese soldiers had to trudge through a field quite literally soaked with Chinese blood. Then they dragged the bodies, all 20,000 of them, to the edge of the Yangtze before tossing them into the water. In the space of just a few short minutes, tens of thousands of lives had been needlessly snuffed out, with the river that had once brought them life now swimming with their blood. In other such incidents, Chinese prisoners were used for live bayonet practice, with soldiers being taught to kill with just one strike. Helpless prisoners were tied to wooden stakes before Japanese soldiers were instructed to plunge their razor-sharp bayonets directly into the prisoners' hearts. Some groups of prisoners were tied together, doused in petrol, then set on fire. Others were beheaded, sometimes dozens at a time, by Japanese officers who wished to perfect their sword strikes. One Japanese officer, Shiro Azuma, later said that, "When I tried to behead the first one, either he moved or I misaimed. I ended up slicing off just part of his skull. Blood spurted upwards. I swung again, and that time I killed him." We were taught that we were a superior race since we lived only for the sake of a human god, our emperor. But the Chinese were not. We held nothing but contempt for them. As the Japanese began to dispense with their so-called mopping up operations, in which those capable of defending Nanking were slaughtered in their tens of thousands, the city was now ripe for the taking. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary who was present during the invasion, wrote the following diary entry on December 15th of 1937. "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday and today, have destroyed schools, have killed citizens, and violated women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them, and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted." Minnie was able to survive the fighting by remaining in what was known as the Nanking Safety Zone. Located in the western portion of Nanking and demarcated by symbols of the International Red Cross, the Japanese agreed to steer clear of the safety zone, so long as it remained devoid of the Chinese military. The area was established by German businessmen, an avowed Nazi, John Reb, and became home to the 22 foreign nationals who remained in Nanking following the arrival of the Japanese. This group attempted to provide shelter to as many Chinese civilians as possible, particularly women and girls. And at its peak, the safety zone was said to harbor almost 10,000 vulnerable Chinese. Japanese soldiers were understandably surprised to find a group of foreigners in their midst, especially a group who refused to leave when given the opportunity. But when it was explained that the safety zone was off limits to them, and on the orders of their superior officers no less, the Japanese generally respected the zone's sanctity. However, John Rabe wrote that, as the days went by, Japanese soldiers began raiding the safety zone to carry off dozens of women at a time. Few ever returned. Throughout the months of December and January, those who remained inside the safety zone began making records of the Japanese war crimes they had personally witnessed. They recorded a total of 450. All were forwarded to the Japanese embassy. None received a response. Some of them read as follows. Case 5. On the night of December 14th, there were many cases of Japanese soldiers entering homes and violating women or taking them away. This created panic in the area, and hundreds of women moved into the Ginling College campus yesterday. Case 10. On the night of December 15th, A number of Japanese soldiers entered the University of Nanking buildings at Taoyuan and violated 30 women on the spot. Case 13. On December 18th at 4 p.m., Japanese soldiers demanded a Chinese man hand over his cigarette case. When he hesitated, one of the soldiers thrust his bayonet into the side of the man's head. The man is now at the university hospital and is not expected to live. Case 14. On December 16th, 7 girls, ages range from 16 to 21, were taken away from the military college. Only 5 returned. Each girl was violated 6 or 7 times daily. Case 15. There are about 540 refugees crowded in number, 83 and 85 on Canton Road. More than 30 women and girls have been violated. The women and children are crying all night. Conditions inside the compound are worse than we can describe. Please give us help. Case 16. A Chinese girl named Lo was shot through the head and killed by a Japanese soldier. The girl was 14 years old. The incident occurred near the Kuling Shu, a noted temple on the border of the refugee zone. Case 19. A 62-year-old woman was attacked in her home at Hanseman. The Japanese soldiers decided she was too old to violate, so they tortured her instead. To their horror, Western observers noticed that Japanese soldiers were targeting Chinese women and girls at an alarming rate. But it wasn't just a handful of platoons or companies engaging in such horrific war crimes. It was the entire Imperial Army, and they were doing so on an industrial scale. Having expected an easy victory over a people they viewed as inferior, the Japanese were frustrated, exhausted, and furious at having faced such dogged resistance. Then, with the city being completely defenseless following their hard-won victory, it created the perfect conditions for one of the worst collective crimes in human history. In the first 4 weeks after the Japanese entered Nanking, there were approximately 20,000 recorded cases of carnal violation, with some experts claiming the real number is around 80,000. If those experts are to be believed, it means the 50,000 Japanese soldiers that occupied Nanking committed 2 acts of carnal violation per minute for an entire month. Japanese soldiers targeted women of all ages, and in most cases, they were executed, then mutilated following what were often group violations. Takakoro Kozo, a former private in the Japanese army, recalled that women suffered most. No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being violated. We sent out coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women, and then each of them was allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for abuse. After the abuse, we would also kill them. On December 19th of 1937, the Reverend James M. McCallum wrote in his diary, "I know not where to end. Never I have heard or read such brutality. We estimate at least 1,000 cases of violation a night and many by day. In case of resistance or anything that seems like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening. The whole Japanese army seems to be free to go and come as it pleases and to do whatever it pleases." American reporter Edgar Snow wrote how frequently mothers had to watch their babies beheaded and then submit to violation, while missionary George Fitch reported that a woman had her 5-month-old infant deliberately smothered by a brute to stop it crying while he violated her. Robert O. Wilson, a surgeon at the University Hospital in the safety zone, wrote in a letter to his family. Extracts read as follows: "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of cases of violation and brutality almost beyond belief. Last night, the house of one of the Chinese staff members of the university was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were violated. 2 girls about 16 were violated to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there are 8,000 people, the Japs came in 10 times last night and violated until they were satisfied. They bayoneted one little boy of 8 who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that penetrated his stomach, but I think he will live. Iris Chang, author of one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Nanjing Massacre, estimated that the number of Chinese women raped by Japanese soldiers ranged from 20,000 to 80,000. Chang also states that not all victims were women, and that some Chinese men were forced to perform repulsive sex acts as a kind of ritual humiliation. As word of the mass violations made their way up the chain of command, the operations top general expressed intense dismay at the unfolding situation. General Iwani Masui is said to have told one of his civilian aides, "I now realize that we have unknowingly wrought a most grievous effect on this city. I feel depressed and can never get in a mood to rejoice about this victory. I personally feel sorry for the tragedies of the people, but the army must continue unless China repents." On New Year's Day, General Matsui confided in a Japanese diplomat that my men have done something very wrong and extremely regrettable. He would later blame the atrocities on the moral decline of the Japanese army, saying, "The Nanking incident was a terrible disgrace. After all our efforts to enhance imperial prestige, everything had been lost in one moment through the brutalities of the soldiers." However, instead of punishing the Japanese troops who were responsible for their atrocities, the Japanese merely decided to open up a series of brothels throughout their occupied territories. Yet these so-called brothels were little more than debauched detention centers where female prisoners were violated in private instead of in public. Following the Japanese surrender in September of 1945, the officers responsible for the atrocities at Nanking were put on trial. General Matsui was indicted for deliberately and recklessly ignoring his legal duty to take adequate steps to secure the observance and prevent breaches of the agreed-upon laws of war. Matsui asserted that he had never ordered the execution of Chinese POW, arguing that he had directed his Army Division commanders to discipline their troops for criminal acts, and was not responsible for their failure to carry out his directives. Matsui was convicted by a majority of the judges, who ruled that he bore ultimate responsibility for what was called an orgy of crime. Others managed to escape justice entirely, such as Prince Asaka, who was granted immunity as a member of the imperial family, or Isamu Cho, an aide to the prince, who committed seppuku during the Battle of Okinawa. Finally, on November 12th of 1948, General Matsui, along with 5 other convicted Class A war criminals, were sentenced to death by hanging. Their sentences were carried out on December 23rd of 1948. Hisao Tani, a lieutenant general who oversaw the massacre, was found guilty of war crimes, sentenced to death, and executed by shooting on April 26th of 1947. That same year, the 2 officers responsible for the contest to behead 100 people, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were both arrested and extradited to China. Both men were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad on January 28th of 1948. In recent years, revisionist historians have attempted to deny or downplay the horrific events which occurred in Nanking during the winter of 1937. The phenomenon is similar to Holocaust denial, in that it not only attempts to absolve war criminals of their culpability, but it serves as an insult to the memories of those that were killed. We, as humanity, must always face up to the brutal, unpalatable, or inconvenient truths of the not-so-recent past. For those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it,